This is the Doorstep, sponsored by the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs, featuring Nicholas Gvosdev, Tatiana Serafin, and Peter Sand. This episode was recorded on August 5th, 2021.
Welcome to this latest edition of the Doorstep podcast. I'm your co-host, Carnegie Senior Fellow Nick Gvosdev.
And I'm Tatiana Serafin, also Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Council and co-host of the Doorstep. Nick, there's so much going on in the news today, but one of the things that I think is getting lost in all of the Olympics coverage, and in my home state of New York, the coverage of our nefarious Governor Andrew Cuomo, is the fact that the Fortune Global 500 list came out, and 143, or depending if you count Hong Kong and China or Taiwan, but basically 28% of the Fortune 500 are Chinese companies. That's government owned and private, very few private, mostly government owned, but that is more than US global companies. I find that is underreported. Are you shocked, surprised, interested? What do you think?
I would say all of the above. I think that this is an important wake-up call to people in the United States who always assert that the U.S. has a more dynamic economy. We are the innovators. We are the ones moving forward, and China lags behind. That, look, Chinese firms are coming into their own. They have clout. And what this again points to is that people around the world, whether they're consumers or producers, they're looking for investment or they're looking for trade, have alternatives. 20 years ago, we were we and our European partners were essentially the game in town. Everyone wanted to come in to Washington, New York, London, Brussels, Berlin. This now says you can actually do good business with China. You don't have to go through the US financial system, the corporate system, and it not only gives options to others, it also reduces some of America's traditional leverage, which is our sanctions threats. You don't want to do things we want, we can cut you off, and you'll be starved, sometimes quite literally. And this suggests, well, there's now a robust Chinese sector which can be an alternative to you. And then finally, the last thing with this is this means that Chinese firms, richer, more of them, that means that's clout that they can start to exercise in international business, and that includes talent, recruitment, influence. So all of this, I think, confirms the trends that we've all talked about for a number of years, which is power, economic power in this case, is migrating from the Euro-Atlantic to the Indo-Pacific basin.
Yeah, and I'm thinking all these business schools are now going to have to create case studies of companies like State Grid, China National Petroleum. These are all top 10, the Sinopec Group, top 10 companies. It's not just Apple. Apple actually comes number 6 on the list, believe it or not. Names that we consider brands here. So I think this speaks a lot to the fact that we need to open up, that the world is at our doorstep, which is what we talk about all the time here. This week, we have the East Asia Summit. We have, our Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, out there talking to all of the countries. Last Doorstep, we had an India discussion. Well, India's at the table. Talking about what's going on in the region and how that region is impacting us. And there's a lot of news coming out from that region. We're going to have a guest in a few moments talk with us about the shutdowns in China and Vietnam and how they're impacting our supply chain. But before that, I want to ask you about your recent article. So let's take it back from Asia, about Lithuania and the importance of Lithuania to US foreign policy. Really? Lithuania?
Lithuania is really a test case for the changes that are occurring in international affairs. In the 1990s and in the 2000s, Europe was really at the center of U.S. foreign policy. This was in the days after the Cold War. We thought of expanding our zone of peace and freedom, starting with Europe and then through the Middle East and across the Eurasian space. Uh, what's changed now, two things, is that as your first news item reported, East Asia is now much more of a center of gravity in world affairs. It's not an annex to the West. It is really emerging in its own right. And that is reorienting the countries that matter. Vietnam, the Philippines, Thailand may start to matter much more than in the past when we thought of Lithuania or Poland or Romania as key players. And the other thing that's changing, of course, and that we will be discussing with our guest, as this has a touches on it as well, is the climate picture. The countries that are going to matter increasingly to the United States are those that are going to be able to help advance the climate, environment, and energy agenda. And so this report, in essence, is to try to provide a roadmap, particularly to Central and East European countries that have gotten used to a relationship with Washington that is essentially based upon looking backwards, uh, dealing with the aftermath of the Cold War, dealing with a resurgent Russia, and essentially saying that in the future, you're going to have to be able to be part of this shift that's occurring to the Asia Pacific, and climate and energy are going to become much more critical topics. And if you want to remain a country of importance to the United States, those are the areas you need to concentrate on.
So interesting. I don't mean to jump this fast to another region of the world, but I do think it was underreported. The recent coup in Tunisia, where the prime minister kind of took control in what seems to be, and we see it in different parts of the world, in an authoritarian manner. I actually, believe it or not, had friends traveling through Tunisia when this happened. So I started to panic because I thought, my God, coup in Tunisia. And they just enjoyed their 14-day holiday as if nothing happened. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about political machinations at the top, and yet life still happening at the bottom.
The Tunisia case is quite interesting because Tunisia was considered to be the most promising of the countries of the Arab Spring in being able to make the jump to full Western style liberal democracy, especially when other countries that had revolutions, starting most notably in Egypt, the promise of the Arab Spring became the Arab Winter. But what has happened in Tunisia points to a larger trend that we've been looking at the doorstep, which is that people increasingly are less concerned in some cases with the forms of political democracy, and they're looking for results, or they're looking for guarantees, or they're looking that life will continue to go on reasonably normally. This, of course, is the authoritarian bargain that we see in Russia, in China. We're seeing increasingly in other parts of Europe. Uh, we see this with millennials and Gen Z being the two cohorts that have the least faith in the efficacy of democratic systems, or don't necessarily see democracy as the best form of government for solving problems like climate change or income inequality. And so this very quiet coup that has taken place, I think, is a warning that after talking about waves of democratization after the Cold War, the world may be moving through an era of re-authoritarianization, that authoritarian states are making comebacks. Authoritarian regimes are showing much greater resilience. Another story that we've looked at the past, obviously, is what's happening in Belarus, where an authoritarian government continues to survive despite the president that the United States and other Western countries recognize visiting, being in Washington in the United States as we speak. Venezuela, the authoritarian government there is holding on. Cuba, where people thought 2 weeks ago that we were on the verge of a massive change perhaps occurring in Cuba. And while the jury is still out on that, again, there's a resilience to authoritarian regimes. And in the case of Tunisia, perhaps even people prepared to acquiesce to the loss of democracy if they think it's not going to really make their lives any worse.
So interesting. Or that we are in a period where we're struggling to find a different mode of operandi. There might be something else out there for this new generation because, and we'll have our next guest join us, Peter Sand, to talk about how shipping ties us all together and how maybe globalization is going to be the answer. So we will see you for that discussion in a few short moments. Very excited today to welcome Peter Sand, the Chief Shipping Analyst at BIMCO, which is the Baltic and International Maritime Council, where he works with all things shipping. Shipping, why shipping, you think, our audience of listeners? Why are we looking at shipping today? Well, does everybody remember what happened in March? A little / big ship called Ever Given, one of the world's largest container ships, caused one of the biggest traffic jams in shipping history, right? In all those pictures, it looked like a little Lego block, but literally hundreds of ships were blocked. That happened in March, and all of a sudden we're here in August, and nobody's talking about it anymore, except 2 days ago on Tuesday, it finally arrived in the UK. And there was a big party. People were having cocktails on the dock, welcoming it back. Now, it wasn't held up in the Suez Canal that long. It was only 6 days. It was held up because nobody wanted to pay for the damages. The Japanese company in Egypt, nobody wanted to take responsibility. It took 3 months in dry dock before it was let go. But that had an impact on all the stuff that was on the ship. And so what we're talking about today is everything that is on your shelf. Where does it come from? And a lot of it comes via container ship, via dry bulk ships. And we have an expert here to talk to us about what's going on. And Peter, I'm going to start with a tweet that you just sent a couple of hours ago, talking about, and I am so shocked and surprised how a lot of China is shut down. A lot of factories are shut down. A lot of factories, almost 35% of factories in Vietnam are shut down, causing queues to build up in the South China Sea. This is happening today, right now. And we are also right now talking about the Delta variant and everything shutting down again. Are we in for another global shutdown?
Fingers crossed, not. But awesome way of starting this podcast. Thanks for having me. I think you're absolutely right. We should pay more attention to global shipping because it basically makes us live the way that we do in our everyday lives. But many of us do take it for granted, and all of a sudden the Ever Given gets stuck in the Suez Canal, and you might even see the memes going around with people trying to put a little bit of lubrication at each side of the Ever Given just to let go of her. Now, what we're seeing in the Far East right now is surely a warning sign that we need to take very seriously. You mentioned the fact that a significant part of the manufacturing facilities in Vietnam have only recently been closed. Ports and terminals are operated at lower level than they would otherwise be. And we have only earlier this week also seen from China something of at least similar tendencies. We haven't seen real lockdowns again like we saw in January, February of last year. Fingers crossed that will not happen again, but we will know that the Chinese authority deal with any variant of COVID in a very harsh way in order to make it stop. And we saw that in Yantian only also 1.5 months ago, where there was a COVID outbreak that impacted container shipping at that point in time. But imagine just for a moment that we will see several Yantian incidents all along the Chinese coastline. that means that we're in for a rough ride of a different scale for container shipping going forward if that happens.
Right, because one of the biggest, I was so fascinated with this, shipping lanes is Far East to North America. That's one of the biggest shipping lanes. And right now it's jam-packed because of the backlog and prices are increasing. So what's going on with that Far East shipping, with the Far East to North America shipping lanes? There's been some rumblings here that ports in Portland and Seattle are jam-packed, ships are waiting to dock. How is that affecting the global supply chain?
It's affecting the global supply chain to a very large extent, because if just to give you a brief overview of the way that global liner shipping works, it basically brings around a lot of semi-finished goods to manufacturing hubs where finished containerized goods then are shipped all over the world. China is the world champion on this, but the greater area in the Far East is basically the manufacturing hub of the world. And container shipping links the production facilities with the consumers in the West or in the Americas, wherever, also in Africa, all across the globe. But what we have seen from the US in their comeback in order to basically revamp the economy of the United States, we have seen not an unprecedented amount of stimuli, but one which is exceeded only by the stimulus following the two world wars. So obviously, with a lot of American consumers eager to spend the money that they have been given by Capitol Hill, that have seen a 40% rise in containerized goods traveling cross-Pacific. And this is one of the vital transits for container shipping from the Far East into North America. The other vital artery of goods goes from Far East to Europe. So those are high volume, long distance. And it's so fast that the demand from the US have built up. So container ships have basically been busy transporting boxes, whereas the container ship terminals and ports alongside the whole Pacific coastline of North America have been unable to handle those boxes as the ships have arrived. So we have seen for the past year, basically, in particular around the San Pedro Bay, where ships that are heading into the ports of Long Beach and Port of LA is anchoring up prior to docking and reloading and also getting boxes back on the empties that they need to return to the Far East. So that whole clogging up of the supply chain have also resulted in what we, I guess, are also going to talk about here, record high freight rates. Liner companies across the globe have been capable of negotiating super high freight rates on the spot market, but also more vitally, if we look further ahead, the contract volumes, which is the main bone for the liners, and especially when you look further ahead, where those key clients get to a certain extent, book in advance their boxes on board the ships to make sure that they can actually get them in due time for the various seasons when they need them on the shelf for the sale. But right now we are close to a breakdown. It is not a breakdown of global supply chains, but we have really seen an issue with those boxes being turned around, especially in North America, and that have caused a global shortage of containers in the Far East, and that have basically been one of the catalysts behind this inflation of freight rates that have multiplied the cost of logistics for many retailers across the globe by hundreds and thousands of percent.
I think that's extremely critical what you've laid out here, because for most people, they don't think about any of this. They go online, they make an order, they click, they say, I'd like it, 2 to 3 days shipping, in terms of domestic shipping, and magically a good appears, and somehow there's not a lot of thinking about how far that good had to travel. Your point about components going from, that it's not that something is just assembled in one location, you have an integrated chain. It's got to move from place to place. And then, of course, physical limitations. A port can only handle so many ships. Ships are waiting. Goods are sitting. Prices are going up. Shortages can develop. I think what all of this also paints, and maybe your reaction to this as well, is does this kind of contradict some of the assessments people were making during the height of the pandemic last year? Two things we kept hearing was, this is going to, people are really going to cut down on consumption now because, and certainly the climate change, people were really predicting that people would stop traveling, we would stop shipping goods, people would have to learn to be more self-reliant where they were. And then the other point that people had was this was supposed to be the great year of onshoring and reshoring, that finally Europeans and Americans would stop depending on this Far Eastern, South Asian, East Asian manufacturing hub, and everything was going to be returning because we had learned the folly of dependence. And yet what the picture you've painted for us says that none of those assessments or predictions of 2020 are turning out. We're consuming. We are consuming from the great Indo-Asia Pacific manufacturing hub. It's traveling across the sea lanes to reach us here, and that none of these ideas that the pandemic was going to be this major break in how we consume may be turning out. I mean, what are you seeing from the data? What predictions perhaps are you thinking about what this may mean for supply chains and consumption and purchasing patterns moving forward?
I think, Nicholas, you bring forward a lot of interesting aspects of the whole lot right now. But I must also say that everything you said and talked about have actually come true, but in different parts of the world. So it may not be the case that the people in North America and in your home country of the US have been saving a lot. But that is totally opposite to what we have seen in Europe, where people have not spent money like mad. Sorry for that expression, but they have the governments of Europe have dealt with the say the aftermath of the pandemic in a different manner. They have supported businesses indirectly and directly more than the consumers directly. So the different approach have also meant that the demand coming from Europe is actually flat from the pre-pandemic level. So we're not seeing a massive demand boost from Europe like we're seeing in North America. But on a global scale, obviously, when people could not travel, they could not go anywhere, they could not go out on restaurants, so they could not spend any money on services. So yeah, a lot of people with extra money at their hand spent those money on goods. But we must also look at where are we now? Fast forward to that pandemic struck year, that national travel activity have actually picked up fairly well. If we look at least China until recently, we can also see the data coming from North America. You're right now in the middle of the driving season. We see finished motor gasoline supplied is basically at 5-year average. So that is fairly normalized. We even see that oil product supplied again on a 5-year average. When compared to that, it's exceeding that, and that relates to actually a lot of trucking business getting those containers around that we talk so much about today. And it's to an extent that what's lacking in terms of demand for jet fuel from international flights, which is still significantly down, is that's basically dwarfed by the demand for the middle distillates for trucking. So there's a lot of things that have been going on, but have happened very fast in some places of the world. So it's actually very well, it's a different pattern wherever you look, and wrapping it all up here basically, because you're also looking further ahead now. How do we believe the shippers and the retailers will react to the crunch that they're facing right now with their goods arriving late, perhaps even too late at some point in time, inventories running down, them being at the same time they are unable to stock them fast enough? Will they consider building more resilient supply chains going forward? And if yes is the answer to that, they need to know also that there are no cost-free resilient supply chains. If you go from just in time to add like just in case, what does that then look like? You can have just in case in many ways. You can have just in case, for instance, if you have well, go back 4 years, Walmart shipped half of its containers out of Shenzhen in the Pearl River Delta in China. If that port was all of a sudden closed down, that was quite close to Yantian. So it could actually have impacted Walmart to a large extent. But if we go by this example, making a more resilient supply chain could mean that they put factories in Vietnam, for instance, like many international companies have done over the past 5 years. They could have built new factories in Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia. They could have brought them back to the home nation if that's the big if they could build the factory, source the supplies, and make robots do the job for them. Because obviously when we talk about manufacturing goods, there's tons of sub-suppliers that feed into the production of this. So bring back your factory also means for instance, from the Far East to Europe or to North America or to Brazil for that matter, or South Africa. You need to rearrange your supply chains just to be able to produce that piece of equipment in a new location. And I'm just asking the question then, when at some point in time, say 12, 15 months from now, 18 months from now, perhaps when we arrive at the next normal of container shipping, where freight rates have come down to a level closer to the ones that we once knew, and a much lower level than what we see now, will importers and retailers then be ready to spend those extra money building more resilient supply chains, or will they still go back to where they have basically been for decades now, chasing the cost-cutting initiatives, embracing globalization, making use of what is still cheap transportation on a global scale, producing where goods are produced most efficiently and cheapest and still at high quality, and then ship them to the area for consuming and for sales. So many questions asked here. If I should give just a little bit of answer also to some of them, I doubt that we will see a huge change to these supply chains. This is without doubt an unprecedented shock, COVID having its label all over the place. But are importers and retailers ready to spend a lot of money changing supply chains that they have basically honed and fine-tuned for decades due to this? I doubt massive changes will be around, but surely some will change.
No, and I think that raises a question too about everyone talks about this, as you said, but it costs money to reorient supply chains. And the question is, will taxpayers want to pay for the costs of additional infrastructure or even the incentives to get companies to relocate? And so I think that this kind of suggests what you're saying is that, yes, this is a shock, but perhaps not a transformative one. But
I would say, I don't know, my opinion is that it cannot be that transformative if only $17 billion of our 2 trillion or whatever trillion infrastructure bill that Biden is proposing, only 17 billion is allocated to ports and waterways. And a lot of that is inland waterways. So I would say that maybe not, but that means that it's going to hit our wallet. So here at the Doorstep, we talk a lot about what does the person on Main Street need to think about in terms of the changes ahead. You mentioned especially that contracts, so that's like 12 months out. So are we looking at an increase in prices in our dollar, in our pocket, or in the euro, by what percent, might you predict, or in after 12 months, are we looking at, if everything goes to plan with, managing COVID, are we looking at a decrease so that this really is just a blip, one-time blip? What do you think?
I think the longer high freight rates stick around, the higher the risk is that it will feed into inflation and higher consumer prices. But having said that, the share of global transportation, at least on the shipping side of it, for liner shipping, is still almost insignificant to the end consumers. Your sneakers might on a regular ship 2 years ago have seaborne transportation cost of 10 cents, be that US cents or euro cents, it doesn't matter. So even $1 of seaborne transportation cost today, which is of course a huge increase in the cost spent on logistics. But still, if you pay $100 down at the shelf when you buy them and bring them home yourself, will you be able to tell the difference? But without doubt, there's always an excuse to hike prices and consumer prices, and the fact that those masters of logistics that reign not only the waters but also hinterland connectivity, they also know that this is an extraordinary situation. They are doing whatever they can to bring those goods to our shelves. But right now, everyone is also in a desperate situation, so they pay up to make sure that the goods are there, knowing that of course the longer it sticks around, the higher the risk is that it will feed into to inflation. But I think above all, inflation also comes from the fact that what I talked about earlier here, the monetary stimuli that we have seen, particularly from the US, but on a global scale, that fact that we have money everywhere, we have no interest rate at all, means that people are also ready to spend money that they would otherwise spend on interest rates and anything else. So it may be the case that this in term gives us at least an opportunity. Also, you talk about, I think Nicholas mentioned the climate activists, or those talking about the climate impact also from COVID-19, thought that perhaps this was an opportunity, and now they realize it's a missed opportunity. But from a consuming point of perspective, we can also see that some of those goods that cannot be fitted into the container ships are getting flown around in the world right now. So I guess everything has a price.
Yeah.
I love that you mentioned the green aspect to it, because there was once upon a time this idea that shipping is more green, it uses less, of this terrible fuel. I mean, it's still bad, don't get me wrong, but it's not as bad as, trucking, which you mentioned, which has gone up in terms of, emissions and detriment to the environment. But yet there was also talk last year during COVID that it was so much better for the whales that we didn't have as many ships out there. What has been, so in your real world, what is the real impact of the green movement? Are ships getting greener? Is there pressure to go green?
Ships are getting greener by the day, in particular container ships. That's basically a reason why Ever Given was also one of the biggest ships in the world. It wasn't the reason why it got stuck, but the development of ultra-large container ships, which is a more than a decade-long transition of the industry, have basically meant that more or less for the same amount of fuel, you could transport twice the amount of goods. Seaborne transportation remains by far the greenest way of transporting commodities around the globe. It remains also the most environmentally friendly way of transporting goods just up and down the coast of, say, North America or in Europe, if you get it to the port and get it out there. So the carbon footprint is there. But obviously, when you have a global shipping industry that transports not only containers but also a lot of iron ore, a lot of coal, grains, soybeans, oil and gas. Obviously, the carbon footprint on a global scale from the international shipping industry is around 3% of global emissions. But well, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, the emissions from international shipping are likely to be cut in half. That is basically the only industry that have a global target for cutting absolute emissions and not only relative emissions. So there is certainly development underway, but decarbonizing something like a global shipping industry is also actually much more tricky than decarbonizing your own your local thermal power plant, where you can basically carbon capture and storage what is emitted from even polluting thermal coal and burning that for power generation. So it's a tall task, but it is something that, well, shipping industry basically have a clear road ahead in order to deal with.
Are there any leaders in terms of either countries or companies in this effort?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, first and foremost, I think we should mention the United Nations body for maritime shipping, the IMO, headquartered in London and basically regulating global shipping business. Too little, too late, some would say. That means that the European Commission, for instance, is now in its Fit for 55 regulation, proposing that the shipping activity internally in the European Union, but also in and out of Europe, should be included in the emission trading scheme that is right now only handling the heavy polluting land-based industries in Europe, but soon to include also shipping. So a lot of initiatives are taken in order to combat the carbon footprints for shipping. But in terms of international shipping, the liner companies are absolutely on the forefront of this, with ships still getting bigger by the year in terms of container shipping. But we have certainly also seen dry bulk ships go to a scale like 400,000 TEU, 400,000 deadweight ton. It's basically carrying twice the volume that you have on the ultra large container ships and burning less fuel. So in many ways, container shipping is advancing, but it's still the part of our industry that can cut emissions to a further extent, and especially on an absolute level.
You know, listening to this, and again, I think why it's so critical for our listeners and others to get a better understanding of this is because, again, most people just think about goods and services magically appear. Sometimes they think, well, maybe a storm delay or something else. But in fact, that there is this very necessary ecosystem of transit that enables this to happen. But again, one of the things that it does come out is listening to your descriptions, how all of this is coming together, is that all of the talk last year that COVID represented the death of globalization, this was the international trading order was fracturing, in a sense of we would stop having these interconnections, and it sounds that COVID has been a shock, but the industry is adapting. Climate is an issue. The industry is adapting. And instead of the people who said these are the things that are going to stop globalization, pandemics, climate, fuel costs, changing consumer demand, in fact, what the picture you're presenting to us is that the system is adapting. And that it is showing a degree of resilience with these challenges, and that the way moving forward is not to say stop. We're not going to stop people buying goods that are made in a global supply chain. They're not going to give up produce that is not immediately in season in their specific area, but will continue to use these supply chains to get fresh produce from one part of the world where it's in season to parts of the world where it isn't, and instead we're going to adapt rather than to change. Is this as you look forward? I mean, is this the trend that you're observing of this adaptation, resilience, but really with the end that globalization continues forward rather than stopping in its tracks?
Very much so. I think that that shipping is basically the facilitator also in terms of the climate impact. You mentioned the fact that that if we should only eat, say, vegetables or fruits which are in season in our local country, I mean, what would happen? Consumers would have an outcry if they could not get them throughout the year. And if the alternative to shipping that kind of goods, those perishable goods on container ships to say the Walmarts or the Tesco's around the world would be to heat up a local greening facility or greenhouse. That would really mean greenhouse gases in its most literal way. So I think that that we should basically re-embrace globalization, and I can only say that there's also a need for that, because any crisis, this includes COVID, of course, have really made politicians look much more inward. They have been, say, more nationalistic across the globe, and they have, of course, looked at their own voters and shied away from being, say, the statesmen of the world, trying to do big trading agreements with global trading partners. But we really need to do that, and I think geopolitics is at the center of attention, at least for the analysis that I do on a daily basis, trying to focus and imagine how will global economic development impact shipping and trade going forward? How will geopolitics either facilitate or put up obstacles to trade going forward, due to the fact that politicians on a global scale perhaps start to dislike one another for any good reason or any bad reason? But it remains a fact that the more reliant we are on one another, the less likely a real war is also. Not only talking about trade war, but if we recall why the European Union was set up in the first place, it was set out of coal and steel because those were the ingredients behind any warmongering nation. They needed the fuel, they needed the steel, and then they could build an army. So the EU is basically a project of peace, and built on the idea that the closer we tie each other's economies, the less likely we go to war. And well, many years down the road now, what a success. So I can only encourage world leaders to make sure that they remain tied closely to one another, economically, politically, mentally, in any way, in order to make sure that we reap the benefits of globalization, that we make sure that some of those great thoughts of economic economists and thinkers of past centuries, where the division of labor and the say the distribution of capital is well thought of. I mean, you should produce goods where it makes sense and then trade. You should not, as an individual country, try to set up everything in your own backyard. If you try to do that, you will only get more costly goods of a lower quality and with a less selection. Would you like that? No.
And I think that's a great message, because that is precisely, when it's put that way, that's something that voters would not endorse. When they hear someone saying globalization failed us, it turned against us, and then you say, well, the alternative is, as you said, we can leave the global system. You'll have fewer goods, higher cost, lower quality, and you're increasing the possibility of conflict, which could very negatively impact you. I think you would find that you would have very different public attitudes. But as you said, it also requires that political leaders embrace that message that you just so succinctly laid out, and hopefully perhaps from one of our viewers passing it on, that would be a great message to start hearing more leaders actually vocalize in the way that you have just presented it to us.
I think it's an important message to keep on saying that. And Nicholas, you put it quite rightly. If politicians basically tell people how it is, at least that's how I see it, it would not be much of an outcry when it would be up for debate, because nobody wants more expensive goods, less choice, lower quality. Obviously, it's a no-brainer. So yeah.
And I think that is a great place to end our discussion. And it all depends on shipping. So thank you so much for explaining our global interconnections, a very tangible one. I talk a lot about the intangible cultural TikTok connections that obsess me, but this is a very tangible connection with goods going from one place to another. And thank you for explaining and sharing your thoughts and ideas with us. Listeners, comment, find us on Twitter at the Doorstep Podcast, get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. And hopefully, Peter, we can have you on again in a few months to see if your predictions are going the way you want them to go.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you all kind listeners for your attention. It's been such great company today and great discussion. I'd love to be back to see if those predictions turn out to be the way that I laid them down, or in a different way. Thanks again.
Thanks for listening to The Doorstep, sponsored by the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. For more, go to carnegiecouncil.org. Stay healthy and safe.